Have you ever looked at some of society's biggest, most stubborn problems and just wondered, why aren't they getting solved? Well, a lot of the time, it's because governments just can't do it all by themselves. Today, we're diving into what's called collaborative governance, basically the whole spectrum of how governments team up to actually get things done. So, welcome. I want you to think of this as our fun little study group for PP 5340. That's Introduction to Public Policy and Management. We're digging into the readings from Section 13, which is all about collaborative governance. We're going to break down the key ideas together, kind of like a cram session before the final. So let's start with the big question that's really driving this entire conversation. Why is it that governments can't seem to solve today's most complex problems all on their own? From shrinking budgets to massive social issues, the old school model of a single agency trying to tackle everything, well, it just isn't working anymore. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with the most straightforward partnerships, governments working with other governments. Then we'll branch out to see how community power fits in, explore some of the riskier business-style models, and finally, we'll land on the really high-stakes world of privatization before we tie it all together. Right, so the need for collaboration is pretty obvious. Governments are under a ton of pressure. The problems are just too big, too complex, and way too expensive to handle alone. This is forcing them to get creative and find partners. So, if you're a government looking for a partner, where's the most logical place to start? Well, with your peers, of course. Our first reading, from Eric Ziemering and Daryl DeLabio, dives right into this foundational idea: governments joining forces with other governments. Ziemering and DeLabio really focus on this idea they call shared services. And the name pretty much says it all, right? It's when two or more local governments make a deal to provide a service together. And listen, the goal here isn't just about saving a buck. It's about being more efficient while making absolutely sure the quality of service for citizens stays high or maybe even gets better. So what makes these partnerships actually work? Well, according to the authors, it's not some kind of magic. It's more like a recipe. You need 3 key ingredients. First, strong leadership to really push for it. Second, a real foundation of trust and transparency. And third, you've got to have crystal clear goals so everybody knows exactly what success looks like.
Okay, let's move on to our next reading. We're going to widen that circle of collaboration way beyond just government offices. This piece by Lyle Ray and Paul Epstein explores an incredibly powerful but often overlooked partner, the community itself. How can governments team up, not just with each other, but with their own citizens?
And this isn't just some fluffy, feel-good idea. Ray and Epstein get super practical. They lay out what they call a community results toolkit, and it has 7 specific tools inside, designed to make these big community collaborations actually work. It's a structured approach to turn everyday residents into real partners on huge issues, everything from high school dropout rates to public health. And this quote just nails the philosophy behind it all. They reference Kania and Kramer's incredible concept of collective impact. The big idea here is that real, meaningful change on these tough problems almost never comes from one heroic organization working in a silo. No way. It comes from getting everyone, nonprofits, businesses, government, schools, all rowing in the exact same direction. All right, let's keep moving along our spectrum because this is where things start to get a lot more complicated and honestly, a lot more controversial. Our third reading is from Catherine Furlong and Karen Bacher, and they look at what happens when governments start to adopt more business-like models for public services. It's a trend called alternative service delivery, or ASD. Now, Furlong and Bacher make a super important distinction here that people miss all the time. They argue that ASD isn't just one thing. It's actually 2 totally separate processes that get mashed together. On one side, you have changes in governance, things like shifting authority around. But on the other side, you have changes in the business model, like creating a whole new corporation or outsourcing a service. And when you confuse the two, that's when you can get some serious, unexpected problems. And this table just illustrates their point perfectly, using water conservation as an example. So a traditional city department, it might create these big, broad conservation programs with a ton of public input. But a separate municipal corporation, well, its business model creates a totally different set of incentives. It's probably going to focus on fixing leaks because that's lost revenue, but it's going to be way less excited about programs that encourage people to use less water because that would literally cut into its income. The business model itself can end up fighting against the public good. And that brings us to our final reading, and to the furthest, most critical point on our collaboration spectrum, full-on privatization. The article by Harold J. Sullivan isn't about efficiency or business models. Note, it's about a potential fundamental threat to our rights. Sullivan poses this incredibly blunt question. We all know the U.S. Constitution protects us from the government. But what happens when the government just hands its power over to a private company? The power to run a prison, to provide social services, to decide who gets benefits? Can it also just hand over its constitutional responsibilities along with it? The answer to that question really hinges on this crucial legal idea called the state action doctrine. Let me break it down. In the simplest terms, it means your constitutional rights, like your right to due process, protect you from the state, from the government. They generally do not protect you from the actions of a private person or a private company. And what's really interesting is that over the last few decades, as this timeline shows, the Supreme Court has made it harder and harder to argue that a private company is basically acting as the government. Back in the 40s through the 60s, the court was more open to seeing the hand of the state in what private groups were doing. But since the 70s, it's gotten much, much stricter. And now the bar is incredibly high to prove that a private company's actions should be treated as the government's. So what's the bottom line? It's this. A public agency has to follow the Constitution. It must give you due process. It can't violate your right to free speech. But a private contractor, even one getting all its money from the government to do the exact same job, is generally not bound by those same rules. Sullivan's big warning is that privatization can become a kind of loophole, allowing governments to sidestep their most basic constitutional duties to us, the citizens. Okay, let's pause for a second and pull all 4 of our readings together. We've journeyed across this entire spectrum, right? From simple shared services all the way to these deep constitutional questions about privatization. And this brings us right to the heart of what you could call the collaborator's dilemma. So what did we learn in our study session today? Well, we saw that simple government partnerships really need that trust and leadership to work. We learned that to really tap into community power, you need structured tools to create genuine impact. But we also got some pretty serious warnings, right? That putting services at arm's length can create incentives that actually hurt public goals, and that full-on privatization can create a constitutional blind spot, putting our fundamental rights at risk. And that leaves us with this one final, really critical question. As governments look more and more to partnerships to solve these huge problems, the real challenge isn't just about finding what works or what's cheapest. It's about how we balance that promise of efficiency with the absolute non-negotiable need for accountability, for equity, and for the constitutional rights that are the bedrock of our entire relationship with the government. Definitely something to think about.